Hello, I'm Tony Collins, and this is the Rugby Reloaded podcast. If you look at any recent book on the history of British rugby union tours, you'll read that the first British Lions tour was to New Zealand and Australia in 1888. But in fact, it wasn't. There was an historic first ever British rugby tour down under in 1888, but the side was not called the Lions. And in fact, the first British Isles Rugby Union side to be called the Lions was the 1950 team that went to New Zealand 62 years later. And the 1888 team was completely unofficial and not recognised by the Rugby Football Union or the game's newly formed International Board. Indeed, the rugby authorities did everything they could to discourage players from joining the team, including banning one of its stars, Jack Clouds of Halifax, for accepting £15 expenses for the tour from the organisers. Although the RFU had been invited by Australians to take a team out to the Southern Hemisphere in the late 1870s, it showed little interest in the game beyond the British Isles. But the huge popularity of rugby across Britain and in New Zealand and Australia in the 1880s raised the interest of sports promoters, and especially those involved in cricket. England's first officially recognised tour to Australia had taken place in 1876, and it had proved so lucrative to the promoters that cricket teams visited Down Under almost every year after that. So it came as no great surprise when two veterans of cricket tours to Australia, Nottinghamshire's Alfred Shaw and Arthur Shrewsbury, announced that they were organising a rugby tour to Australia and New Zealand in 1888. From the start, the tour was a purely commercial venture, as Shaw openly conceded. "We arranged the trip in the hope of making money," he said. Not surprisingly, the RFU secretary Roland Hill refused to support or approve the tour, and also warned players that if they accepted anything more than travel expenses, they would be banned from the game for breaking rugby's amateur regulations. For sharp entrepreneurs such as Shaw and Shrewsbury, the RFU's amateur regulations suited their purposes perfectly, as Shrewsbury admitted shortly before they left Britain. "If the rugby union can get players to come out without paying them anything, all the better for us," he wrote to Shaw. The side was captained by Bob Seddon, the Swinton forward, and 14 of the 22 players selected were from clubs that would create the Northern Union just a few years later. 3 others came from the small industrial town of Hawick in the Scottish borders. 1 each came from Edinburgh and Cambridge universities. 1 was an unattached gentleman, and 1 came from Douglas in the Isle of Man. The final player was Andrew Stoddart, the future England cricket and rugby captain, who played his rugby for Blackheath. Awkwardly, Halifax's Jack Clouds was called before the RFU committee just before the tourists left Britain and cross-examined about the expenses that he had been given by Shaw and Shrewsbury in advance of the tour. But by the time the RFU had reached a decision and declared him a professional and banned from the game, Clouds had already set sail with the tourists, placing him in the unfortunate position of being unable to play in any of the games while he was down under. But Clouds was not the only player to receive money. The tour's most famous player, Andrew Stoddart, had been bound to the tour by a down payment of £50, with more to follow. How much Stoddart eventually received is unclear, but can be gauged by the fact that 2 lesser-known amateur players had been offered £200 in expenses to make the trip. Of those who did go, W.H. Thomas of Cambridge University in Wales was paid £90 for the 30-week tour, and then tried to negotiate a further £3 per week when the tour was unexpectedly lengthened. There were other advantages to being a gentle amateur on tour, as can be seen from Shrewsbury's request to Shaw to say, "Which amateurs you have promised to pay their wine and refreshment account at dinners." Unfortunately for Shrewsbury, Shaw had neglected to organise such social distinctions adequately, resulting in an on-board drinks bill of over £68. The team eventually arrived in New Zealand for the first leg of the tour on the 23rd of April 1888. Over the course of the next month they won 6 out of 9 matches, drawn with Wellington and losing to the powerful Auckland and Taranaki sides. The New Zealanders were taken aback by the way in which the tourists heeled the ball out of the scrum quickly and the speed with which they passed the ball between the backs. These were lessons that the New Zealanders would take to heart, and which would eventually become hallmarks of All Black rugby. The British side then went back across the Tasman Sea to Sydney to embark on the first half of the New South Wales leg of the tour, winning 4 matches and drawing 1. They then took to the field in the Melbourne suburb of Carlton to play their first ever game of Victorian rules football, now known as Australian rules football. It was not a success. Carlton, then as now one of the biggest names in the Victorian game, ran amok, scoring 14 goals to the tourists' 3. But, as would be expected from a team of such talented athletes, the more the tourists played Victorian rules, the better they got. Eventually they managed to win 7 of their 19 matches in the unfamiliar code, but overall it was not a pleasant experience for them. They were glad to get back to rugby. I imagine that none of our men liked the Victorian game, Bob Seddon told Sydney's weekly newspaper The Referee. The tourists then went through New South Wales, Queensland and a second leg in New Zealand without losing a match. They returned home to Britain in November, having won 27 of their 35 rugby matches. But their impact could not be measured simply by their win-loss ledger. As they wound their way across Australia's eastern seaboard, they attracted bigger crowds than had ever been seen for rugby matches before. And the game became a tangible link with the place that even those born and raised in Australia called home. The tour once and for all established that rugby would be the premier game of New South Wales and Queensland, but it also had a deeper cultural impact. As the Australian press noted, the majority of the British tourists were men from the industrial working classes in the north of England. Rugby in Sydney and Brisbane had traditionally been the preserve of the upper and middle classes, but the tourists demonstrated that it was equally a game for those who earned their living through manual labour. To compete successfully against overseas visitors, wrote the referee, Australia would have to see the working man element introduced into our clubs. But, just as in England's northern counties, the coming of the working class player to rugby would bring new and intractable problems to the sport. When they returned back to Britain in November 1888, confusion surrounded the tourist amateur status. Many expected the RFU to ban the players for professionalism, but to everyone's surprise, the RFU lifted the ban on Jack Clowes and the matter was quietly dropped. The reason was simple. Any investigation into the finances of the tourists would have implicated Andrew Stoddart and the other gentlemen tourists. If the charges of professionalism had been pursued, the RFU would have had to ban one of England's leading sportsmen, and to have maintained the ban on Clowes but taken no action against Stoddart would have been to admit openly that different rules applied to different classes of players. Nevertheless, by ignoring both their own regulations and the overwhelming evidence of payment, the RFU had laid bare the underlying class bias of the amateur ethos. A middle-class gentleman was by definition an amateur, whether he was paid or not, and was not to be judged by the standards set for other working-class players. In hindsight, the 1888 tour was a snapshot of where the strength of British rugby lay in the late 1880s. At its head stood Bob Seddon. Born in Salford, Seddon was a warehouseman whose rugby talent had seen him rise to captain Broughton Rangers and then Swinton, and now he occupied a place that no other rugby player had ever done before, captain of the first British touring team to Australia and New Zealand. Like Harold Wagstaff, Jim Sullivan, Alan Prescott and the other working class men who would captain future Rugby League Lions tours down under, Seddon earned his position because of the brilliance of his skills and because he also possessed all of the intangible qualities of a natural leader. Shrewd, smart and brave, he was able to stay calm while crisis engulfed those all around him. I don't think I was born to be drowned, he wrote home after the ship's team had encountered some especially stormy seas en route and he had almost been swept overboard. So, as the team made its way across the big cities and country towns of Australia and New Zealand, Seddon was universally recognised as their spokesman, leader and inspiration. And then, out of the blue, while spending an afternoon rowing on the Hunter River in Maitland in New South Wales, his rowing boat overturned and he found himself unable to get his feet out of the boat's stirrups. And there, alone and trapped by a simple everyday mistake, Bob Seddon drowned. He would never know how important he would be to the game that he had graced and loved. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Rugby Reloaded podcast. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my name is @CollinsTony, and if you want to dig a bit deeper into the history of rugby and the other football codes, take a look at the Rugby Reloaded website at www.rugbyreloaded.com. Until next week, thanks for listening.